Good evening, everyone. So my name is Alex Ferrer. I am the district's assistant superintendent for business, also board secretary. Dr. Hazel kind of did a nice intro of kind of the progress that we've made over the last couple of months in the budget development cycle. And so I'm going to go into a little more detail as we kind of review the plan for the 25-26 budget and the fiscal year to come. So for the most part, this is kind of just a rough outline of what we're going to discuss tonight. The terminology and other kind of aspects of the presentation will go into various levels of detail. And then obviously at the end, I'll turn it over to Mr. Brito in case the board has any questions. So starting off, just based upon, conversations that I've had with members of the administration, the board, building on the work that Mr. Boyce, the administration, and the Board of Ed have done over the course of years. I just wanted to kind of provide a little bit of a foundation with reference to some of the terminology, just to kind of facilitate communication as we go through this. So the DOE requires that districts break up their budgets into specific funds. And the goal is, and this is kind of in line with GASB standards, the goal is to promote transparency and comparability between organizations, in this case, obviously, school districts. So, starting off with funds, you'll see that the budget is broken up into four main funds. Three of them have to be reported. One of them is Fund 10, which is the operating general fund, and this is the annual budget that kind of governs the district's operations from July to June. Fund 20, which is special revenue. These are financial resources that have very defined purposes. Typically, it will be something like state and federal grants, local grants, student activities. Fund 30, which we're not presented tonight because it doesn't have to be approved as part of this submission of this budget, is major construction projects that are expected to go beyond multiple years. So in the event that the district proceeds with the referendum planning, referendum proceeds would be reported in Fund 30. And then finally, Fund 40, these are debt service. These are resources that are used to pay back long-term debt, more specifically the 2021 bond issuance. Going down to a little more detail with reference to the revenues and the appropriations. At the end of the day, for each one of these funds, the revenues have to equal the appropriations in terms of having a balanced budget. So local tax levy, pretty straightforward. Those are the funds that are collected from the municipalities to support the budget. State aid, like we've talked about, and we'll get into a little more detail in terms of kind of the trend of state aid over the last 10 years. Those are different kind of resources that the state provides. And there's two components of this, two sub-buckets. One of them relates to the funding formula, which is where we spend the majority of our time. And then there's a component of it which is extraordinary aid, which we submit an annual application and then consequently receive some reimbursements over the course of the summer. Finally, on the revenue side, we have fund balance. And these are unused resources that the district has access to support future year's budgets. So as an example, in the event that we lapse X number of dollars at the conclusion of this year, those funds are to be used to offset the needs of future year's budgets. And then on the appropriation side, for the most part, the programs are major expenditure classifications, accounting, jargon, function obviously goes into a little more detail. Examples would be instructional support services. And then finally, object is the actual service or commodity that is being purchased. So on the appropriation side, we'll focus on the object because obviously that's the easiest one to kind of focus on. So moving on to the actual revenues. So as you can see, those same funds that I kind of highlighted before, Fund 10, Fund 20, Fund 40, 10 operating budget, 20 special revenue, and 40 debt service. The major things that to kind of focus on here is that the district's overall budget that is being presented tonight for consideration by the board, the majority of the funds relate to Fund 10, which is the district's operating budget. That's where we'll spend most of our time. Fund 20s, like I mentioned before, are kind of targeted to specific purposes, so that will change minimally year over year. And then obviously Fund 40 is statutory required, the repayment of debt. So as we kind of break down a little bit further in terms of kind of revenue sources, the proposed budget actually has the tax levy increase, like Dr. Hazel kind of outlined, with the tax levy incentive aid. I'll talk about that a little bit more in case for folks that were not able to be present or haven't watched the video on the district website with reference to the presentation that we did at the last meeting. As you can see, the tax levy increase would be a one-time increase of 13.5%. On the tuition, a slight increase dollar-wise. It seems like a high percentage, but for the most part, from a dollar standpoint, pretty straightforward. Those are just kind of anticipated additional tuition dollars that we might be able to kind of bring in as a result of incoming students. Miscellaneous revenue. This one seems, once again, another one that kind of seems a little bit off. And basically what this is primarily interest that the district kind of collects and other kinds of components that are not kind of, don't fall evenly into kind of another bucket. One thing that is kind of skewing the 24-25 number are the encumbrances that rolled over from the 23 to 24 year. So, but other than that, the numbers are kind of pretty flat year to year. State aid, like Dr. Hazel mentioned, the district accounts for not only the $916,000 that we lost in state aid, but also the anticipated extraordinary aid application that we're going to be submitting later this spring. And then in addition to that, the $1 million match that is part of the tax levy incentive aid application. So the program basically says that if the district were to increase the tax levy up to the adequacy budget, and like I said, I'll get into a little more detail in a little bit, for the most part, the state will match 5% of those dollars up to $1 million. Federal grants, the big reduction there relates to special education Medicaid initiative funds. They are completely reworking the formula of how they allocate those funds for eligible students. Bless you. So that we're seeing kind of a big drop there. And then finally, fund balance. And this is something that we've kind of talked about a little bit in previous meetings, where the concern is just the ability to regenerate that money year after year. And fund balance has a direct correlation to unused dollars that we have from the subsequent year. So the ability in terms of kind of having these conversations with other kind of finance professionals and kind of colleagues, as well as our own auditor, the target is that we can allocate a fund balance that we feel is responsible for kind of recurring kind of long-term kind of implementation. And then finally, reserves. The major change there is that for this 25-26, we are projecting 2 reserve withdrawals. One of them is $750,000 for 2 capital projects, outlined also in the resolution tonight, and then $130,000 for maintenance reserve to just overall support the maintenance, the facilities maintenance budget. Both of those numbers represent about 10% of the existing balances of the accounts. Now, state aid, this is something that we've shared before. Obviously, prior to me, Mr. Boyce kind of went into a lot of detail to kind of be able to kind of outline kind of this trend. So for the most part, the last 7 years, that's where the district has seen the greatest decline, and that's primarily as a result of the S2 budget cuts and the formula aid cuts, excuse me. So the interesting thing here, especially for projected for 26, the district kind of did away with the whole idea about equalization aid. The intention there is that as the conclusion of S2 was sunsetting in essence, that the state kind of reallocated the funds into the other buckets. Now, so what does that basically mean for the district? So for most districts, that I have seen kind of state aid cuts over the last 7 years, what the tendency has been is that as the district has kind of made cuts, and as we've seen in kind of some of our neighboring districts, including Toms River and Jackson and Middletown, we're not that far behind in terms of kind of where we stand with reference to the impact to the district's operations. But what this graph basically shows is that over the course of that roughly same 10-year period, that the district's local tax levy has had to pick up a bigger share of the district's budget. And that's kind of one of those critical components of this, because at the normal pacing, the 2% tax levy, and I share this kind of very straightforward with people, is death by 1,000 cuts. And the reason that I say that is because the 2% tax levy, as a taxpayer, I could definitely appreciate what the intention was. Obviously, certain costs were kind of out of control. Certain municipalities' tax rates were out of control, and I respect all that. Now that said, 2% on those revenues will never equate to the average of the last 20 years, which is roughly a 2.4% consumer price index. And especially over the last 5 years, where that number has been in excess of 4%, we'll never be able to catch up. So this is something that is a greater kind of conversation that needs to obviously take place at the state level, and it's impacting more, abruptly the districts that have been impacted by S2 over the last 7 years. But it's ultimately one of those things that will have to get revisited. And like Dr. Hazel said, in the conversations of both from an administration standpoint, the Board of Education, and public, the intention is that at some point the formula gets ironed out, and this becomes less of a concern. But the thing that we've kind of seen here as well is that as a district, and then I'll kind of get to it a little bit later in terms of the budgetary cost per pupil, the district has made some cuts, right? In terms of staffing, in terms of as the enrollment has dropped, the district has made cuts to try to kind of pace and to minimize the impact to the taxpayer and obviously to the students. So in terms of kind of sequencing for the budget year, we basically projected some increases, primarily in areas like salaries, benefits, and utilities. This year especially, we're anticipating a high electric utility cost year over year. Then we kind of moved on to the impact of the reduction of the state aid and what would that do for the district. Finally, moving on to the next kind of bubble, discussions with finance with reference to the impact and how we could close that gap, 2% tax levy, and ultimately adopting a tentative budget, which took place 2 meetings ago, and then moving forward with reference to making cuts to the appropriations to balance the budget, and ultimately the tax levy incentive aid, which for the folks, like I said, that weren't present at the April 10th meeting, the basic concept here is that districts that are below adequacy, and so what does that basically mean? That basically means that the difference between what the DOE deems to be the sufficient financial support for a district for a thorough and efficient education, and the amount actually being spent by the district. So in our case, that number is close to $30.3 million that we are projected to be below adequacy for the 25-26 year. And like Dr. Hazel mentioned, as part of the tax levy incentive aid program, they basically said you can raise your taxes up to that amount. Now, like Dr. Hazel mentioned, the projection and the recommendation before the board is to increase that to just over $19 million. But the state has that matching component, which is the 5% up to $1 million. So more importantly, especially for the community, for the public, why are we even considering this? And so the major thing is that obviously it reduces the significant risk that we have with reference to that gap, like I mentioned, between revenues, inclusive of the 2%, and the expenditures kind of outpacing those revenues. We basically would eliminate the need for a, the need for a referendum that is large in scale and possibly over the next decade. So we can obviously take those funds, dedicated, commit to using those funds for the purposes of taking and addressing our underfunded and aging infrastructure. And this is something that the district, meaning administration, that we're proposing to the board, we would basically, in partnership, kind of commit to that over the next decade, in essence, to kind of minimize the risk for that referendum. So that's the reason why that tax levy incentive aid program is being considered, and then consequently the recommendation for tonight. As we move over to appropriations, the administration is proposing the budget that obviously takes into consideration the tax levy incentive aid program that we talked about. This is basically the breakdown by object code, which is one of the terms that I kind of talked about before, which is the most basic kind of metric that the DOE requires us to report on, which is the service or commodity being purchased. So in terms of kind of some of the highlights, we see that the majority of our dollars are in salaries and benefits. For FY26, that number equates to about 64%. The average probably throughout the state is anywhere between low 70s and 80%. As compared to the 25 made up about 70% of those dollars, right? So the major driver here that you see is primarily the heavy focus by the district on equipment. So equipment, what does that basically mean? That talks about not only instructional equipment, that things that happen in the classroom, as well as the facilities and HVAC improvements that we were talking about in supporting kind of on a consistent basis. Now, in terms of kind of what's in the budget, so the major kind of delineation here is with the 2% tax levy cap. We probably would be looking at reducing about 15 positions, reduction in state and support services. Obviously, it's assuming some additional risk with reference to health benefits. This is an area that the district has been able to kind of navigate a little more successfully over the last few years, primarily because we're out of the state plan, we're self-insured, we could kind of minimize some of those third-party costs, middleman types of costs, but we are seeing that pressure for 25-26, and part of that pressure comes on the back of prescription drugs. It's not, it shouldn't come as a surprise to folks that are kind of either in that field or kind of just aware of the role of some of these prescription drugs and the costs that the insurance plans are picking up. Had we been in the state plan, we would be seeing double-digit increases on health benefits, on both medical, prescription, and dental is kind of a little calmer in that market, in that industry, but definitely medical and prescription. So the additional risk would be, like we talked about with reference to, on this same, if we kind of went with just a 2% model, dependency on generating surplus and fund balance that we talked about, and then also leasing versus purchasing primarily of technology equipment. And this is one of those things that the district has tried to stay away from as much as possible, for two reasons. One of them, once you get into the leasing cycle, it's hard to get out of it, right? And then the second component is just the added cost that on an annual basis, you're incurring finance charges. So it would be just added cost and more pressure on the budget. So in terms of kind of the proposed budget with the inclusion of the tax levy incentive aid, 10 of those 15 staff are being restored. Increase in mental health support services, obviously the upgrades to facilities, HVAC, instructional spaces, primarily targeting science classrooms, instructional support and materials that obviously would be close to the students. And then the last piece is also within the capital projects, we have 2 gym floors at 2 buildings. Now moving on to the comparative piece here, right? So every year the state the Department of Education releases the Taxpayer Guide to Educational Spending. And the actual naming convention has kind of changed a little bit over the last decade or so, but for the most part, this is an area that Freehold Regional, as the largest 9 to 12 district in the state, always takes advantage of kind of some cost-saving mechanisms just because of our size and our operation. And for the most part, and I shared some information with the board with reference to a couple of other kinds of indicators, because each one of these is kind of its own indicator. This one specifically is the general total budgetary cost per pupil. But if we were to look at things like legal and administration, we would fare very, very well. So this trend that you see here in terms of how we compare to not only the state average and median, but also the other 9 to 12 districts, as well as Monmouth County, that trend is pretty historically sound. And in terms of kind of for future years, as part of the administration kind of trying to maintain an efficient kind of operation, this is not expected to change all that much. Because ultimately that's, and I know that Mr. Boyce has stood here in the past and basically said when the state looks for models for regional districts, we should be at the top of that list. If nothing else, just because of the large academic programs that we have, and obviously the value for the community. So the one thing that we get not necessarily criticized, but we get questioned on periodically is to say, hey, what adjustments has the district made over the course of the loss of enrollment? So just to kind of give some perspective, in 2008, that's when the district kind of had its largest kind of enrollment. The average daily enrollment in 2008 was close to 11,700 kids. If you count the share time kids, that definitely was over 12,000. And in 2024, we're just under 10,000. Now, in terms of staffing levels, because obviously how that compares, the district in 2009 had just over 1,400 staff members, and this year we're under 1,200. So for the most part, as if you were to look at these tables year over year over the last 7, 10, maybe 15 years, like I said, these trends are pretty consistent. And basically the district just tried to kind of match its operations and level of effort in an effort to kind of keep up with costs in the best way possible to minimize the impact on students. So in terms of estimated tax rates, so every year the Department of Education releases what's called the regional allocation. And basically what that does is kind of changes column 2, which is the appropriate share that falls the responsibility of each municipality. And that percentage share is based upon primarily 2 factors. One of them is the equalization valuation of that municipality and compared to the rest of the group. And then the other one is how enrollment changes for each municipality with reference to the group. And they do this not only for 9 to 12 in our case, but also elementary education, just to kind of see what that trend is. So for the most part, if the municipality's valuation is going up, if their enrollment is going up as compared to their other peers, then chances are you're going to pick up a larger share of that pie. So column 3 is the most recent calculation of the tax rate as it stands right now by municipality. Column 4 is the preliminary tax rate based upon the proposed budget that we have tonight, and the difference in terms of the rate changes and then the percentage changes in the rates as well. So for the most part, this is kind of concludes the presentation. We have, this is kind of an outline of the presentation highlights. My contact information is there at the bottom in case any member of the public wants to kind of reach out and has any questions. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bruder in case the board has any questions for me.